Don't look at it! You can't look at it!
Hello, I'm David F. Sandberg, and let's talk about shooting a short film on Super 8. How we did it, what it costs, what my process is in Resolve for working with the footage, and is it really worth it? So yeah, Lotta and I recently shot a short little horror film on Super 8 film, Call of the Ocean. If you haven't seen it yet, there's a link below. So why shoot on Super 8 in the year 2025? Well, it's something I've always wanted to do. When I first started making little short films with friends back in Sweden, it was the early 90s. By that point, it was all VHS. Super 8 was super dead. And it was always disappointing when your little movie just didn't look like a movie. I remember we were really delighted one time when we got a big lens flare in the camera because to us, that almost looks like a movie. Even though I grew up in the age of VHS, I was very aware of Super 8. Since this was before the internet, I used to borrow books about low-budget filmmaking from the library, and they were pretty out of date, and they talked about techniques for shooting on Super 8. I also saw this documentary about the making of Peter Jackson's Bad Taste, where he showed some of the stuff he had shot on Super 8 as a kid. It's a really great documentary. I don't know how many times I've watched it throughout the years. There aren't a lot of feature films that have been shot on Super 8, but there are some, and I had 2 of them on VHS when I was younger. The Dead Next Door, which is a zombie movie. Oh shit. And Necromantic, which is not a zombie movie. Back then, one of my friends actually had his parents' old Super 8 camera, but for us, there was just no place to buy film or have it processed where we lived, so we had to stick with video. While Super 8 wasn't an option while growing up in Jönköping, Lotta and I eventually moved to Los Angeles, where there are places to buy and process film. So I did think that maybe I should just rent a Super 8 camera for a day just to finally try it out. But it was one of those little dreams where you think that, yeah, one day I'll do that. But then you just never do. But I married an awesome wife, and for Christmas a couple of years ago, she got me a Super 8 camera and some film. So now, there was no excuse. Lotta really did her homework because this is a great camera, the Canon 814 XLS. Now, if you don't know much about Super 8 film, since it was made for consumers, they kept everything pretty easy. Like film comes on these cartridges that you just pop into the camera, much easier than loading a 16 or 35mm camera. A lot of Super 8 cameras record at 18 frames per second, so you get more time out of each cartridge. At 18 frames per second, you get a little over 3 minutes of footage on each cartridge. But 18 frames per second is pretty choppy and definitely not a video standard. You really want to get a camera that can also shoot at 24 frames per second, like actual movies. At 24 frames, each cartridge gets you a little under 2.5 minutes, which is not a lot. The film comes in either daylight or tungsten color, so no fiddling with the white balance, it's either daylight or tungsten. The daylight film comes in quite low ISOs, like 50, while tungsten goes higher, like 500. Of course, the lower the ISO, the less grain you get. 50D film is quite clean, 500T film is grainier. The neat thing about Super 8 cartridges is that they have these notches in them that tells the camera what kind of film it is. So you don't have to set the camera to what ISO the film is, it already knows. The camera comes with an inbuilt color correction filter for daylight, so if you want to shoot tungsten film outdoors, you flip this switch and the white balance will be correct. This switch will do nothing when you insert a daylight film though, because the camera will then disable the filter so you don't mess up. I've heard that these built-in filters aren't always very good though. Usually it's just a piece of plastic, and in these old cameras, who knows what condition it's in. So if you want to make sure to get the best quality when you're shooting tungsten in daylight, you can use what's called an 85 filter and put on the lens instead of using the built-in filter. The camera I have has a lot of great features like frame-by-frame shooting for animation, time-lapse, auto and manual exposure, manual or motorized zoom, macro, 2 different shutter speeds, and a slow motion button. It only goes to 36 frames per second, which isn't super slow, but it ramps to that speed in the middle of the shot when you push that button. So you can go back and forth between normal speed and slow motion in the middle of a shot, which is pretty cool. A great thing about this camera is that it doesn't have a separate battery for the built-in light meter. It uses the same batteries that power the motor. I've heard that some Super 8 cameras can have broken light meters or they use weird batteries. Now, if you have a camera where the light meter doesn't work, it's not the end of the world. You can use, well, an actual light meter or a light meter app or a digital camera to, check what kind of settings you would need. I use the internal light meter, but never in auto because it can adjust the exposure quite drastically. I check what the light meter says right before rolling and then I set it to manual. This camera actually records sound as well. It came with an extendable microphone and has various sound settings. The problem though is that I don't know of any places that can get you that sound. When they scan the film, you only get the picture. Now, I don't think the sound would have been great quality anyway, but it would have been neat to have a scratch track to sync to. The camera seems to hold sync pretty well though when you record on an external recorder, at least for the clips that I've tried.
Hej Lotta,
Hej David!
är du i synk?
Jag är så jävla i synk.
Kan du säga något mer?
Merry Christmas, god jul och ett riktigt gott nytt år. Mjau, 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 mjau.
Klappa en gång till.
So I've shot a bunch of tests and things just for fun, but I wanted to shoot a short film on it. At first I was going to shoot Cam Closer 2 on Super 8, but it didn't feel right. Ideally, I wanted to shoot something outdoors. I just love how nature looks on Super 8. And if you shoot in sunlight, you can use 50 ISO film, which gives you that cleaner image. Lotta and I were in Sweden recently, and I brought my camera and some film. I figured maybe we'll do a short, and if not, I'll just shoot some Sweden footage, just for fun. But while there, I started thinking about what we could do. I mean, the way we make shorts, just Lotta and me, can be quite limiting, especially since we've already done a bunch of shorts. It can be hard to come up with new scenarios with just one person on screen. But we could always add the voice of another character without adding another actor, and going down this talking to a voice path led to this short. What also turned the short into what it is was the limitation of not doing any visual effects. Super 8 really isn't a good format for visual effects. It's low resolution, grainy, and not a very steady image. There was still one VFX shot, but I figured it was simple enough to get away with. Now, I only had 3 cartridges of 50D with me, so about 7 minutes or so, 7.5, which is not a lot. So we had to really think through what we were doing and try to mostly do one take of everything. We could do 2 takes if needed for certain things, but we tried as much as possible to get things in one take. So if, for example, you see the shadow of the stupid cameraman in a shot, well, that's the only take you have and you just live with it. The first shot we did on a tripod, but everything else was just handheld. For focusing on the camera, there's a split image focusing screen. The tricky thing about cameras like this is that in the viewfinder, it can look overall like things are sharp, but then the film isn't. It's not like a video camera where what you see is what you get. The way to set focus is to zoom all the way in to what you want in focus, use the split image screen to set it, and then zoom out to whatever focal length you want. The lens is parfocal, so it won't lose the focus by zooming in and out. Of course, if you want to change focus during a shot, you don't want to be zooming in and out, so what you can do is check all the positions before, see what the focus should be at each point, and then rack the focus between those points as you're shooting. This is much easier if you have a follow focus that you can set marks on. I didn't use that on this film though. Super 8 has a very small negative. The equivalent today would be a small sensor on a video camera, which means that the depth of field won't be very shallow. Especially not in the case of this film, which was shot on the wider end of the lens and stopped down to between f8 and f11. I tried to just keep a similar distance to the point of focus throughout each shot. We didn't worry at all about sound during shooting and instead added it all in post. Since I had so little film, I didn't want to waste any of it shooting a clapperboard or something. I just wanted to start rolling and go action.
Action.
These cameras also aren't very quiet, so it's very easy to pick up the sound of the camera itself if you're recording sound at the same time. Resolve has a really good AI voice isolation tool now that can get rid of stuff like that.
Jag är så jävla i synk.
Vill du säga något mer?
Jag är så jävla i synk.
Vill du säga något mer?
But still, this is how we've done it on most of our shorts anyway. Get it shot, deal with the sound later. For something emerging from the ground, I first thought of like putting something inflatable under the ground, but that was overthinking it. We just buried Lotta's arm. Always keep it simple.
Snabbare, snabbare, snabbare. Nice.
So after we shot the film, we of course had to get it processed and then scanned. Let's talk a bit about the cost of shooting Super 8 because it's not cheap. A cartridge of film will cost you about $40. For processing and scanning, I've tried two different places, Pro 8mm in Burbank and the Negative Space in Colorado. The Negative Space is awesome. They're the cheapest and in many ways the best. To process and scan in 2K, it's $45 per cartridge. 4K is $50 a cartridge. The only downsides with the Negative Space is one, their turnaround time. For Super 8, it's about 4 weeks, depending on how busy they are. And two, that in my case, I have to send the film via mail. Things sometimes get lost in the mail, so it can be kind of scary to send away film. Pro 8mm are local to me, so I can just drive over there and hand over the film, and it just takes 5 to 7 days to get it back. A couple of things worth mentioning about Pro 8. You can buy your film elsewhere and then have them process and scan it, but they also sell their own film. Now, as far as I know, their film is just repackaged Kodak film, so it's the same thing. But when you buy their film, you also pay for processing and scanning at the same time, and together it all gets a little cheaper than if you bought your film elsewhere. Now, Pro 8 have a ton of options for scanning, file formats, and delivery. The cheapest option is just a 720p MP4 file, which I wouldn't use. But on the higher end, you can get crazy expensive with 6K HDR scanning and 10-bit DPX files. One very important thing to know is that when you make your selections on their website, you will see something called Global Access. This is their online file storage service where you get a link to download your footage. This can get ridiculously expensive. If you choose a large format like 6K DPX files, the online storage will be over $2,000 for one cartridge. Global Access is selected by default, but you don't have to use it. What I do is I bring my own USB drive that they put the footage on, which costs nothing. Now, since Pro 8 have so many options, and depending on what you choose, it can get really expensive, what do you really need? Well, honestly, there's not really 4K worth of detail in Super 8. It's definitely not 6K. I did a 4K scan on this short because I figured that maybe it's nicer grain or something, but I don't know if I could actually tell the difference in a blind test. You can also choose between log or HDR scanning. While they look very different out of the box, log is of course, just like on video, low contrast and desaturated, while HDR looks more like things are supposed to look. But while you have to do some color grading work on the log footage, once you've matched them, they look pretty much the same to me. So if using Pro 8, I think a good option would be to buy their film, do a 2K scan with log color, export to a ProRes file, or DPX, but I think ProRes 444 is definitely good enough, and supply your own USB drive. One of the great things with the Negative Space is that pretty much the only choice you have to make is do you want 2K or 4K? Because HDR and everything else is always included. So if you're not in a rush and you're not overly paranoid about the Postal Service, they're pretty great. When scanning the film, I choose to use overscan, which means it looks like this, with the sprocket holes visible. But in Resolve, I'll then crop it. I'll also stabilize it since Super 8 can be quite jittery. Resolve has an excellent stabilization tool. Once or twice I've had a shot it didn't work on, but then you can take it into the Fusion page and do more advanced stabilization. On some shots with too much flicker, I'll use Resolve's deflickering tool. An important note here is that the default setting for this tool is time-lapse, but this will mess with the details of your image. You have to set it to advanced controls. Even if you don't mess with the controls at all, this option gives a better result than time-lapse. Now, since it's film, you're going to get some dust, scratches, and hairs. I'm perfectly fine with a certain amount of that. It's part of the charm. But I will remove the bigger, more distracting ones. Resolve has a great dust buster tool for that. The options I found work best are the ±2 frames option or the simple clone option. You don't want to use spatial, which does this weird thing. Resolve has an automatic dirt removal tool, but I find that it tends to eat up a bunch of actual detail. I always finish off with some sharpening. This will bring out the grain more as well, but I like grain. You can use noise reduction to really clean the image up, but then you lose some of the charm, in my opinion. And what I've found is when you upload to places like YouTube or social media, a lot of the grain will disappear in the compression anyway. To do the one VFX shot in the film, I painted milky eyes in Photoshop and tracked them in using the Fusion page in Resolve. I also wanted the title and credits to look film-like so that they fit in with the film. I added some blur and halation, and the title I tracked to the background so it would match the unsteadiness of the footage. For the end credits, I used weave to get some of that unsteadiness. I also added flicker and some dirt using the film damage effect. We made sure to record a few sounds at the location, the ambience, the footsteps on those particular rocks, moving those rocks, the shell landing on rocks, and walking in water. Then back home, we recorded the rest in our closet. For the voice inside the shell, we used a glass measuring pitcher over the microphone.
Please, don't move. It gets you when you move.
Some things we'll record with the movie playing and repeating what we see, like breaths. Or the sound of clothes. We left the shell in Sweden, so to get the sound of handling it, I used a thin ceramic bowl from our kitchen. Is it worth shooting on Super 8? Well, in a way, not really. Compared to digital these days, the quality is technically much worse. It's a lot harder and it's expensive. But it is fun and it's cool. I enjoy it and I love the look of it. And with creating, it's just as much about the process itself and the enjoyment you get out of it. But yeah, shooting Super 8 is unfortunately not cheap. These days, there are ways to emulate it really well if you still want the look. There are plugins you can buy like Dehancer or Film Convert, but you can also get pretty good results just using Resolve and the built-in tools. Beyond just the color tools, you have effects like halation, film grain, weave, flicker, and film damage. Interestingly, I have tested playing videos on a screen and just shooting the screen with my Super 8 camera, and it kind of looks like if it was just shot on Super 8. So you could shoot something on digital and then do this low-budget film out and get the imperfections and quirks of Super 8. That way, you'd only need as much film as the length of the finished project. I'm really glad to have fulfilled one of those little dreams that probably won't happen. And I want to shoot more on Super 8. I do also have a 16mm camera, but that's maybe for some other video.